Hello, and welcome to the newest edition of Inside Judicial Watch. I'm your host, Jerry Dunleavy, a digital strategist here at Judicial Watch, and today's topic is election integrity and voter fraud. And I am joined today by one of the nation's leading experts on election integrity, the director of Judicial Watch's Election Integrity Project, Bob Popper. So thank you very much for joining me, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. So before we dive into this, Bob, if you'll allow me, I'm going to talk just very briefly kind of about your background to show that you are a serious guy, that you know your stuff. So you spent 8 years at the Department of Justice in the voting rights, in the voting section of the Civil Rights Division, including 5 years as the deputy chief of the voting section of the Civil Rights Division. So you have a lot of experience there, and I was actually hoping that we could start our conversation off with you just explaining to our audience, our viewers, our followers, a little bit about what your time at the Department of Justice was like.
Sure. I was recruited there in 2005. I previously had written articles on gerrymandering and on voting-related topics, and they found me and asked me would I like to join. And so I started my work there in the voting section, and it was an interesting time. It was during the Bush administration, and there was a focus at that time on election integrity, a focus that we frankly haven't seen since.
Yeah.
While I was there, we commenced 5 lawsuits under the statute known as the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, and that's the statute that we're enforcing now here at Judicial Watch. We're enforcing it here as we call it at the People's Justice Department, because the actual Justice Department has pretty much abandoned that statute. But at the time, we commenced lawsuits and got good settlements against Missouri, Maine, New Jersey, a number of states and jurisdictions, Philadelphia as well, and Indiana was a settlement that we obtained. So I know how to do that kind of lawsuit.
Yeah.
And that lawsuit is primarily concerned with states cleaning up their voter rolls, taking people off the rolls who have died, who moved out of state, who are ineligible for some other reason.
And these are, so to take a little bit more broadly, you're talking about the NVRA, the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, and that's what you were helping enforce at the Department of Justice. Now, you said during the Bush years there was some success at enforcing this law, but you were also there for a brief period of time, for actually a number of years during the Obama administration as well. Would you be able to kind of go through what sort of shift you saw there with the enforcement of the law?
Yes, I mean we saw a dramatic shift. One that people may have heard of is there's a case called the New Black Panther Party case, unrelated to the National Voter Registration Act. But this was a gentleman who saw fit to bring a club to a polling place in Philadelphia. We commenced a lawsuit to enjoin that kind of activity. During the Bush years and during the Obama administration, the reach of the lawsuit was curtailed and it was basically shut off. And the remedy that we got was insufficient in my view. People may have heard of that, but that attitude of the Obama administration officials closing off what the Bush administration officials had commenced pervaded the new administration. The new administration, the Obama administration, essentially abandoned the NVRA. It's easier to say the National Voter Registration Act.
Agreed. Let's just stick with that.
Easier to remember. And I brought the last case that the Justice Department ever brought in 2007 and settled the last case in 2009.
The last case, 2007, under the NVRA, 2007. So 10 years since the last
government.
case.
Since the government has enforced the statute. Private parties have been trying to pick up the slack, but they do not have the resources of the federal government. It's an unfair fight. The government should be involved and should become involved in this fight. And I have high hopes that it will again.
Good. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the NVRA itself. and then let's dive into what Judicial Watch is trying to do to pick up the slack that that the federal government is obviously missing out on its obligations, isn't enforcing the law. So let's start with kind of what obligations states have under the NVRA, if you would.
Sure. The NVRA is basically a two-part statute. The part that everyone or that more people are familiar with is called the motor voter part. Mm-hmm. This is a Clinton-era statute, and the motor voter part of the bill ensures that people can be registered to vote at the motor vehicles department of their state. Mm-hmm. And it has other provisions making it easier to register. And in return for making it easier to register, part of the bill concerns election integrity. And that requires states to make a reasonable effort to remove ineligible registrants from the voter rolls. People who have died, people who moved out of state and can't vote anymore, people who are barred because of a disqualifying felony conviction, and people who become mentally incompetent. And the statute provides for the removal of those registrations. And the two parts were supposed to work together. Mm-hmm. The problem is when an administration like the last one decides that it's only going to enforce half the bill. There's something not fair about enforcing only half of a compromise bill.
Right.
And that's what's going on. So the part that we want to enforce requires states to identify people, particularly, the largest class of ineligible registrants is usually just people who moved.
Right.
Okay, they go to another state. I mean, if you've moved, imagine in your life, I've moved several times.
All the time, yep.
Yeah. You don't pay a lot of attention during the chaos of moving to canceling your last voter registration. And so states typically have to pick that up. They'll send out mailings. There's a whole procedure under the NVRA for sending a forwardable mailing to someone who is thought to have moved out of state. And states can use any number of ways to determine who may have moved. Mm-hmm. When states don't do that, they get great big fat voter rolls.
Because you've got someone registered in their state that's long gone.
That's long gone. And then you have new people moving into the state legitimately registering.
Right.
And so you get registration rates rather than the norm in this country, which is, let's say, mid to low 80s. You get registration rates exceeding 100%. Now, what I mean is that means there are more voter registrations than there are eligible voters over the age of 18.
And we see that all over the country.
Yeah, Judicial Watch did a study in which they identified out of about 3,000 counties in the United States, about 400, more than 400, where they had more registrations than citizens over 18. And some of these are worse than others. There can be a narrow range of understandable reasons why this happens. If, for example, a jurisdiction had recently tucked in aggressively to making sure that everyone on the voter rolls was eligible to vote, you might see a brief spike in registrations, because before someone can be removed for moving somewhere else, there has to be a waiting period of 2 to 4 years. And so briefly people will be put on that list, and then eventually they will fall off that list. That's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is the second type of high registration, which just shows that a county, a state is just not removing people at all. And we saw that in California, and we saw that in Kentucky, and we've sued in both of those places.
So let's talk a little bit about Judicial Watch's efforts here in this area. We did pick out, I believe it's 12 different states that we had sent notices to. Can we go through kind of why we settled on those 12 states, what we were seeing there?
Sure.
And then we'll dive a little bit more in depth into California and Kentucky.
Sure. Well, it's speaking politically, it's red states, it's blue states, it's pink states. It's
across the board,
randomly distributed.
Yeah.
We identified the ones which had either the most counties or the most egregious single counties in terms of having registration rates exceeding 100%. We picked, for example, Kentucky, where 40% of all their counties had unbalanced registration rates, 48 out of 120 counties. And we picked also just Los Angeles County, which by one count had 112% registration rate. And then we called up the county and we said, all right, what's your real registration rate? You know, this one is the one that was reported to the federal government. What's the real rate? And they said, well, we're not publishing that, but here's the real rate, you know, the real registration numbers. And when we did the math, they had a registration rate of 144%, which makes them, out of 3,000 counties, one of the 10 worst in the country. Real, you know, league leaders. I would tell you as well that the entire state of California has a registration rate of adult citizens exceeding 100%.
And that would seem to be a bit implausible.
Yes, and I can guarantee it's not because they've recently undertaken massive efforts to clean their voter rolls.
Right.
They have, for example, in the state of California, the highest rate of what we call inactive registrations. And tell me if I get too much into the weeds. But
no, not at all.
An inactive registration is someone who typically has been identified as probably having moved. And under the NVRA, they get sent a letter. And the letter says, are you still there? Do you still live there? And if the letter doesn't come back, you have to wait 2 to 4 years. It's 2 general elections. Mm-hmm. So it can be, you know, if a general election just happened, it's almost 4 years. So you have 2 more. If a general election is about to happen, it's more like 2 years. But so it's 2 to, you follow? It's not necessary. 2 to 4 years. 2 to 4 years. And for that 2 to 4 year period, if at any time the person who received the letter shows up and votes, that's that. They're back on the rolls. They're not slated for removal. The whole process stops. Mm-hmm. If they don't, then their registration can be removed. And that's what's not taking place in California. That's not in Kentucky. It appears that they're not even sending out inquiry letters to anyone to determine whether they may have moved out of state.
So under the NVRA, what states are supposed to be doing is sending out these sort of inquiry letters. This isn't a process where someone is removed from voter rolls right away. It's a process that can take 2 or 4 years, a long period of time.
Oh, it's incredibly painstaking.
And what you're saying is that the states that we're sort of honed in on is Kentucky and California, and the number of other states aren't even doing sort of the basics.
Well, it's state by state.
Yeah.
Kentucky reported to a federal agency that they had not sent out any confirmation letters in a 2 year period that was measured. Now, you know, either that's just an unbelievable refusal to follow federal law, or the real number is embarrassing, and so they just didn't send it in. In either case, we're going to find it out. That's what happens when you sue.
Yeah.
You know, I mentioned that we're suing Kentucky and California. We also sent letters to 10 other states.
Yeah,
and we're in ongoing discussions with those states to get information from them, to find out what the story is. And, you know, we're by no means done suing people.
So this is just beginning. And like you said, it's red states and it's blue states. I'll go through the states. We have Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Tennessee, and California. And the 2 states that we've sued are Kentucky and California. Right. So a broad sort of swath of states that you see these problems in. Can you tell me what, with these 2 lawsuits that we have, the one in Kentucky and the one in California, what is the ultimate goal here? What's the process, first off, for this lawsuit, and then what sort of outcome are we hoping for? What's sort of the goal here?
Well, you know, if at the end of the day we can't agree with the jurisdiction we sued over the fact that they're not performing their obligations, and we take it to a court, we have to go through a litigation. We undertake discovery, which means we get documents from them pursuant to official process. They have to respond. They can't say, we're not going to tell you, or a federal judge will get very angry. And we get to look at how they're doing their process, and we explain it to the court. We explain the shortcomings. And then if they continue to fight us, ideally we win. The court issues a judgment and says, you have got to come up with a plan to start to remove ineligible registrants. And we, as the plaintiffs, we get input into what that plan should look like. That's, the parties can't agree, they fight the entire time, that's the outcome we want.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always willing, we're always willing to settle a case, to talk to a jurisdiction, to figure out what it is that they might do that would solve the problems we've identified. I mean, people should understand this. We don't just send out threatening letters. We don't just threaten people and sue them and take them to judgment. Our letters are always saying, show us these documents. We want to understand this. We've noticed this particular problem. Explain this to us. And if we get back a letter, friendly, unfriendly, whatever it is, we respond to it. We say, tell us more. This is interesting. This is not. We're always looking to achieve a result. We're not just looking, in litigation parlance, for scalps. I mean, we don't keep score that way. We're trying to get as many jurisdictions as we can to comply with federal law. And the outcome is simple. Remove people who are dead from the voter rolls. Remove people from the voter rolls who don't live in your state anymore and can't vote there.
Right. And exactly. Now talk with me a little bit about why that sort of thing matters. I mean, obviously enforcing the law is good in its own right, but talk with me a little bit about why this process matters, why making sure that voter rolls are clean and accurate. Ultimately, why is this important?
Well, the short answer is that it prevents fraud. But I want to expand the conversation. I know that a lot of our listeners will know about the disputes over voter ID.
Yeah.
And that's to prevent one kind of fraud, impersonation fraud. You show up at the polls pretending to be someone you're not. The NVRA is concerned with many more kinds of fraud than that. The most common kind of fraud, I think most experts agree, is absentee ballot fraud or mail-in ballot fraud. Because you get a piece of mail, it's the safest thing to do if you're trying to break the law. It's very hard to track. Another kind of fraud is double voting, okay, which has nothing to do with the whole voter ID debate, because someone who, say, lived in California and moved to Nevada and then votes in Nevada and then also sends in a ballot to California, there's no impersonation fraud there. They are who they say they are.
Right.
So this is a different kind of fraud. The National Voter Registration Act is also concerned with lowering the cost of get-out-the-vote efforts. I mean, think about it. People rely on voter registration rolls to determine whom to contact, to tell them, are you registered? Have you voted? Is this registration accurate? Please get out and vote. Here are the issues of concern to you.
And if that's totally inaccurate,
you're mailing to thousands of addresses using postage when these people are dead or these people don't live in the state anymore. So it raises the costs of those kinds of efforts. So there are a number of frauds that it prevents. And it also just, everyone has a story about someone who, goes to his father's condominium in Colorado for vacation and somehow manages to vote there when he doesn't live there. There are a lot of different ways that people take advantage of the rules. And the American people see this. They know this, and they're disappointed with the state of American electoral practices. By some polls, we are incredibly cynical about how elections are run in this country. Part of fighting that is just enforcing the laws that are already on the books. And that's what this is. That's what we're doing.
Right. And you said it's not, like you said, it's not just, the voter ID debate. We are sort of talking about almost a bigger, broader issue. Problems with absentee voting, with double voting, like you said, even, the inaccuracy now of get out the vote efforts and that sort of thing. So talk with me a little bit about, beyond those lawsuits, the broader sort of efforts that even though the federal government is sort of shirking its duties to a large extent, there are some states that are trying to that are trying in various different ways? Are you able to kind of go through? I know that we've sent briefs of support for a couple of different states. Would you be able to kind of walk me through where that stands?
Well, for example, one NVRA related issue that we're very concerned about is some states will use, how do you determine that someone may have moved out of state? And, once you've determined that under the NVRA, you send them an inquiry letter. Do you still live where you say you do? Or where we last had you? There are a lot of ways to determine how someone may have moved out of state. One way is just if they haven't voted in a couple of years. Mm-hmm. Ohio had a law that said, if you haven't voted in 2 years, we're going to send you a letter. And that's the law, state law. And the letter is the NVRA letter that just says, do you still live there? Georgia had the same law, except for them it was 3 years. Mm-hmm. A number of other states have some sort of voter inactivity as some sort of trigger somewhere in the process. I think we counted up in a brief we filed, I think we counted up 19 states that somehow look at voter inactivity and doing their voter list maintenance. Well, a plaintiffs group sued in Ohio. Mm-hmm. Bear in mind, Ohio is a state where we sued in 2012 before I joined Judicial Watch, and we ultimately settled that lawsuit. And the state of Ohio agreed that they would send out more regularly these letters.
Okay.
And so we have a written settlement agreement with the state of Ohio. Well, that settlement agreement was put in risk by a recent lawsuit. The lawsuit was filed by plaintiffs who said that sending out notice letters, address inquiry letters, on the basis that someone hasn't voted in a while, is the same thing as removing them just for not voting.
Sending out a letter. Their contention is sending a letter is the same as just pulling them off the list.
Yes. Now the thing is, there's a federal provision, which is pretty uncontroversial and straightforward, which is you can't remove someone just for not voting. Mm-hmm. You can't just say, you haven't voted in 2 years, you're off the rolls. And you have to, all that means is you have to follow the procedure I've been talking about over and over, which is you have to send them a letter, you have to see what their response is,
right?
And then you have to wait 2 to 4 years. So you can't just take them off. Now they've tried to reinterpret that provision to say, if you even send the letter based on a lack of voter activity, you're removing someone for not voting. Now, I think that's not just a misinterpretation of the statute. I think that's a crazy interpretation of the statute. I mean, the whole purpose of the statute was to find occasions where you could send out inquiry letters. These people aren't being removed for not voting. In fact, if an inquiry letter goes out and it comes back, they're not removed at all. If an inquiry letter goes out and it doesn't come back and then they vote in the next 2 to 4 years, they're not removed. What happens after the letter is sent out depends on the voter. So no one's being removed just for failing to vote. Now, the Supreme Court took this case, and we've been submitting energetic amicus briefs at every stage of the process.
And this is for the state of Ohio.
This is for the state of Ohio. We're also involved in the lawsuit in Georgia alleging exactly the same thing.
In a circuit court, right?
Yeah, it hasn't yet reached the Supreme Court. It's
right.
in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals.
Yeah.
And in both of those cases, we're making the point that, look, no one's removed for failing to vote. They're removed for failing to respond to a letter.
Right. And these are states that are in some way actually trying to fulfill their, various different obligations under the law.
Well, yes. And, what bothers me, I mean, plaintiffs are free to allege whatever they want, but until there was a change in administration, the plaintiffs who brought these lawsuits received support from the United States government.
So the Department of Justice tasked with enforcing the law was actually on the side of
the
people that were
who would like
challenging
to restrict
yeah.
states' ability to comply with it.
Yeah.
Yes. And
that is a bit of a complicated situation, to say the least. And that's what you were dealing with when you were at DOJ.
Well, yes. I mean, what's the phrase? Bringing it back. I mean, what I saw in 2005 to 2013 is now, being replayed when we're in a situation where, again, the United States government is taking an aggressive, active position, or it was when these lawsuits were filed, in which it tried to curtail the effectiveness of the NVRA, a federal agency trying to curtail the effectiveness of a federal statute. Now, since the new administration has come in, the Trump administration no longer supports the position in these lawsuits that was taken by the Obama administration. It's important to point that out. They've submitted briefs now to the Supreme Court saying, not us, count us out. We don't say this anymore. And that's valuable and that's helpful. It has to be pointed out. But just, sort of what we started talking about, there's something dishonest and not fair about looking at a federal law that does several things, picking the ones you like and enforcing those, and ignoring the parts you don't like.
Right.
For electoral advantage. Or for, I don't want to characterize why people do what they do. You tell me. Or perhaps they can tell us.
Yeah. So, and like you said, I mean, so where the federal government has fallen down, Judicial Watch has stepped up as the people's, Justice Department and that sort of thing. You said that the Trump administration is changing its tone, changing the tone a bit. Change its position. So let's talk about what the Trump administration is doing. I know that you testified at the Trump administration's Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. Can you talk a little bit about that? And we'll wrap this up with you talking a little bit about that and about where you see things going in the future. Is Judicial Watch essentially going to get, do you see us, getting help or assistance, or do you see the Department of Justice putting more effort into the sort of things that Judicial Watch is doing?
Sure, I do. I testified in September before the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, and I talked about enforcing the NVRA and how important that was. And I'd like to say a word about the commission. It has inspired some of the most heated, hysterical, non-rational responses I could ever have imagined. It is a commission, and it has the authority to issue a report. That's it. Mm-hmm. And so to hear people, some of whom I professionally know, saying in the media that it's a scheme or a conspiracy to suppress voters or suppress the ability to register and vote is just irresponsible. That is, it couldn't do that if it wanted to, but what's more, what it's doing is so necessary. We need data. We need data on all these different kinds of fraud. To go back to the Obama administration, it has aggressively fought to keep data from coming to light. There is a database called the Systematic Alien Verification to Entitlements Database. It's not specifically about voting, but it keeps track of who is entitled to federal entitlements. And it tracks who is a non-citizen. And states had to sue the Obama administration to have access to that database in order to compare their own voter rolls to it.
So these might be states that are trying to determine whether
people
that are on their rolls are actually citizens or not, and they had to sue to get this information.
Well, yes, they sued. They got it through a settlement, but then it was provided with so many restrictions that it was practically not as useful. But by the way, there's something fundamentally wrong with saying there's no evidence for voter fraud and then suppressing the data that might help you determine whether that's a true statement. But putting all of that to one side, we need data on voter fraud. There's a lot of suggestive evidence that a lot of different kinds of voter fraud go on every election, but we need to be able to quantify that. As it is now, a lot of states don't even keep track of convictions or prosecutions or investigations of voter fraud. In a lot of states, it's just not that severe or heavily penalized of a crime. So what the Presidential Advisory Commission ought to do in an ideal world is gather data. And that's what they were doing. And I deplore these efforts to portray it as some sort of conspiracy. Another point I'd make is that they asked states for their voter registration lists. States have different laws about how they provide their voter registration lists. 14 states refused to do it for, I think, showy political reasons. Not the higher number that was frequently reported, 14 states. And people should understand that we at Judicial Watch right now have about 6 states' voter rolls. Okay, you ask for them. They give them to you, sometimes for free, sometimes for money, sometimes for $100, sometimes for $1,000. We purchase these and we look at them. These voter lists are out in commercial ventures all over the country. People rely on these. As I said, people look at them when they're doing get out the vote efforts. So the idea that this is some sort of state secret that no one should ever be entitled to get is ludicrous. So that all that being said, it was an honor to testify to the commission, and I urged them to gather further interest in renewed enforcement of the NVRA. I think that the Trump administration will do that. All the signs that I've seen are hopeful, and we'll get this sort of lawsuit back to the kind of an actor, the federal government, that has the resources to pursue it all over the country. We don't.
Right.
We're limited. I wish we could.
We do what we can.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, well, Bob, I really appreciate you bringing us all of those insights, and I highly encourage all of our followers to continue following the excellent work that you and your team are doing, our lawsuits in California, our lawsuits in Kentucky, and all of our ongoing efforts, and then what we're trying to do at helping at the Supreme Court and the Circuit Court level,
and lawsuits to come, and
many lawsuits to come. So, thank you very much for being here with us on this episode.
It's great to be here.
Voter fraud, election integrity, it's a very important issue, and you guys are doing some great work. So we appreciate it, and thank you very much for joining us today on this edition of Inside Judicial Watch. Until next time, I'm your host, Jerry Dunleavy. Have a good one.